But yeah, like reading the intro to the book, it sounds like we grew up in a similar place.
Oh yeah.
East
Where are
Yorkshire,
you from?
from Hull.
Well, I'm from Driffield, so
Right.
yeah, I mean, like Hull was a paradise compared to Drift because you actually had shit to do. I mean, I know that wasn't a great time to grow up in Hull because it was like, well, it wasn't a great time, but like people were very cruel about Hull around that period of time. It was like that whole, you know, worst towns in the UK kind of thing. But you know, I
Yeah,
loved
yeah.
Hull because it was like, you know, I could go bowling and go laser quest and all that kind of stuff, which I couldn't do at home. But oh no, that's funny. Nice one.
Well, I actually went to school in Beverley as well, so it's pretty close to Driffield, yeah.
I was born in Beverley.
All right, okay. Where did you go to school in Driffield?
Yeah. So like, I was born in Beverley because that was like, I mean, that hospital doesn't even exist anymore. That was just the nearest hospital. So I grew up in a really tiny village called Lowthorpe until I was about 11, then moved to Driffield like for senior school age, and then yeah, stayed there until I moved to Sheffield basically.
Ah, okay, yes. Oh, how old are you then? Are you like the same age as me, I think maybe.
Well, a few months ago I turned 40, so
Ah, a bit older than me, slightly. But yeah, just interested, always interested to know how people are in terms of, the music that
yeah.
they're
So
experiencing.
would you have come up under like would you have been a Paddington's boy? Was that your
Yeah,
thing?
yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty much nailed it there, yeah. But yeah, I mean, were you into that? I mean, what age did you leave Driffield again? For uni, was it?
Yeah, so left Drift at 18 in 2004, well, late 2004, you know, like to start the academic year. Um, so yeah, left then, yeah.
And how into like, the noughties guitar scene were you at that point?
At that point, very much so, yeah. I mean, like I kind of, I got a little sniffy about it as like within a couple of years, well, I think in Chef, but at that point, I mean, like you couldn't be more like tick box cliche, really. I mean, we ran a little indie night back in Driffield called Time for Heroes, obviously.
In Driffield?
In Driffield, yeah. I mean, there's no nightclubs there now, but at the time there were two. There's
Okay.
one that was called Hooters, which was like it wasn't like trying to be an American, you know, boob bar Hooters or however you want to call them, but it nicked the logo and it did have a strip pole in there, so it was kind of like if you were into more commercial stuff or if you're into drugs, it had a little upstairs room for dance music. But at that point, we went to the one across the road called Mavericks, which was like, you know, more alternative. And you could get in there underage, like, so we were, you know, in there. So yeah, when we were sort of 17, 18, we ran nights in there. I had a friend of mine who was really good. I wouldn't say friends, but I think he followed them around so much that they put up with him. He was a huge sort of like crib stalker. So like they very kindly, with the Paddingtons actually, came and played a show for us in Driffield for like, I
Yes.
think they just did it for beer money and fuel or something like that. Which was funny, and no one, yeah, I would have thought no one would have come to that, but they did. So yeah, at that point, prior to leaving Driffield, yeah, very into that. That was because you know Driffield there wasn't any record shops, there wasn't any gig venues or anything like that. So you know it was just what you could get in Woolworths, which would be you know CDs of the time, Enemy, etc. So yeah, real cliche like enemies, the Bible kind of stuff around that sort of 16, 17 period, and then changed a fair bit once I got to Sheffield. But prior to that, yeah, I was squarely in that camp.
Yeah, I remember going on some bad nights in Beverly. Like, do you remember Parker's nightclub in Beverly?
Do you know what? Funnily enough, I don't think I ever had a night out in Beverly because I think at that point when we were young and skint in Drift, and like because I left when I was 18, if you were underage, it was a real risk traveling to another town or city to go out because if you got rejected, it was like you basically relying on someone's mum and dad coming to like collect you or whatever. So
Hmm.
we had a few nights out in Hull when we'd turn legal age and would go to like Welly and you know
Yeah.
places like that and
Spiders.
never did spiders actually. No, I don't
Ah,
know.
right.
Like and loads of some friends did, and my little brother who's several years younger than me, he went to college and he did all the spiders thing. But no, so we'd see bits at the Adelphi, do bits at Welly. Um, But yeah, I don't know why I never made spiders. I feel like I missed out there. Like that was a bit of a rite of passage if you're from East Yorkshire. So yeah, that one missed me by sadly.
But it's still going, I think. So
Is
never say
it?
never.
Do you go back very often?
Not really now, because I got like my little boy here and stuff.
Sure.
So not that often. But my grandma's still in Beverley and that, so get across when I can. How
Nice.
about you?
I mean, yeah, I like once or twice a year, like Christmas stuff like that. When your grandparents start dying.
Right, fair enough. Yeah.
But to be honest, it's one of those places that, I mean, as I alluded to in the introduction to the book, like I left like really resenting because it was just like if you're young and you're hungry for music and experience and culture and all these things, it was just there was nothing there, and like I hated it and couldn't wait to get out of there quick enough. But I've warmed to it as I've gotten older. You know, it's like it's quite nice. You know, it's like got you go back and it's got like a nice little deli selling like natural wine and cheeses and shit. It's like, you know, in my little neighborhood in Sheffield, I don't even have that where I am. So it's like, yeah, Drift's doing all right.
Yeah, yeah. I know when I moved to London from Hull, it was like couldn't find a sandwich shop that was good. That was as good as the one near me. I was like, surely in London you could find that. All right. I'll give a bit of a full intro as like a separate thing to this, so I won't read out the full thing in front of you.
Yeah, no worries. Whatever works. Yeah, whatever works.
But obviously, like, I want to get into your journey into making the book. Like how you end up being a prolific writer for The Guardian and stuff. Like, how does that happen after growing up in Driffield, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, so I left Sheffield, study university in Sheffield, with no real desires to be a journalist or a writer. I went to study film, and then dropped out of that and switched to like film and media production, which was a bit more hands-on. I was a terrible student. I didn't go. I just partied all the time. It took me 5 years to finish my degree. And because of the time period that I went in the mid 2000s, all the things I'd learned were completely obsolete by the end of it because all the technology had changed. So it was quite a way to waste your degree, really. But during that period of time, you know, I think when you're just that age, aren't you? When you're young and you go, it's your formative years. Everything you hear music-wise is new, whether it's old or it's new, it's new. And so I was just sort of having my mind blown by stuff all the time, and I was just experimenting with creative writing at home, like doing little short stories and bits. And then at the time, the university still had a student newspaper, so I got in touch with them and started doing a few bits for them. I mean, I'm glad none of that's still in circulation. Just really, really bad stuff. And then just from there, just started doing bits for like publications for free. I mean, it was never like a career plan. I never in a million years thought it was feasible to do it. I just never viewed it in those terms. It was just literally, I love music, and at the time it was a way to get free CDs and get into gigs. And then sort of turned into a part. Well, then, you know, you start getting a little bit of pocket money from it because, you know, like the first time I got paid for it, like my mind was blown because I just didn't kind of realize that was even a thing. So I was very, very naive around it for a long time. And then bit by bit, it just sort of kind of became a profession. I mean, I worked for free for a long period of time. And I think if someone would have like sketched out the trajectory and said, if you want to do this job, you'll have to work for free for the X amount of years, then for next to nothing for another few years, and then eventually, like, you know, after that many years, you'll earn a meager living, and then eventually it'll all go all right. I'm not sure many people would like sign up for that, but because I was approaching it sort of quite naively and never thinking about it in career terms, it just sort of happened, I guess. But over a fairly long period of time, yeah, it was not quick and easy by any means.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we had a conversation over Twitter, I think a few years ago, because you were trying to get hold of Dominic Masters and Wolfman.
That rings a bell. Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I
Yeah,
think you got hold of Dom, yeah, because I was reading that article again today about kind of, I think it was when Meet Me in the Bathroom came out, so you kind of interviewed a few key people from the UK side of it.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, when that came out, I think it might have been when the documentary version of the book came out. I thought, yeah, I'd speak to some of the people from the UK scene to sort of, yeah, do an equivalent version kind of thing. Which obviously now I think there's a couple of books forthcoming on that, isn't there? And
Yeah, yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, bringing back memories. Dom, yeah, because I used to have a lot of close friends who were very close friends with Dom around that time. Yeah. So it was interesting to catch up with him again.
Yeah, that's an interesting read. But yeah, I guess segueing into like the interviews you've done for this book, you said like 150 original interviews.
150
Right?
plus, yeah. I didn't count the final number, but it was, yeah, it's over 150, somewhere thereabouts, yeah.
So where did it all start? Then obviously I had an idea at some point, I guess.
It was a weird one, really. It was like, it just, there was no like light bulb moment. It was just, I've been writing about bits of Sheffield music history for years. And then it was like, it was like this slow realization, like, why don't I tie all this together? Like, no one's really done a book properly on Sheffield music before. There's been some stuff done locally on like quite sort of condensed periods of time or genres or whatever, but no one's really like made the case for Sheffield as a music city and like connected the dots throughout the years and the various genres and stuff which all kind of connect. So yeah, I'd been doing bits, and I think I'd done a couple of bits for The Guardian a few years ago. One on a nightclub called Jive Turkey, which was sort of like a seminal nightclub in the late 80s, early 90s in Sheffield. And that had gone down really, really, really well. And by that point, I'd been thinking about the book, but then I kind of thought, nah, I'm not going to do it. Because I was going to do it like, I don't know, late 2010s. And then there was a period around lockdown where I think Jarve announced his book, Martin Ware from Human League in Heaven 17 announced his. And I was kind of like, oh, I've missed the boat here. There's probably like too much Chef overkill. But then when I'd done a couple of articles like that had done well, I was like, oh, actually, yeah, there's still stories to be told here. So I think it was just this sort of slow realization that, yeah, there's a bigger story to be told here. And so, I did a proposal 3 years ago, I think, for it. And then we signed up to do it in 2023.
Yes. And it's interesting because I heard Chris McClure of Arctic Monkeys album cover fame talking about Sheffield and the idea that it's quite humble about its musical heritage. And I never really switched on to that. And then obviously you talk about that in the book. It's an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah, it's a massive theme. Yeah, it's a massive theme. I think people are becoming more and more aware of it now. But yeah, I mean, it's like it's not cool to be a big head in Sheff. Like you don't shout, you don't crow. I mean, it's not unique to Sheffield. I've come across a lot of other sort of predominantly working class towns, not always northern. I was in Birmingham last week for an event, and like similar feeling there. But I think if you compare it to cities, like Manchester and Liverpool, maybe even Glasgow to an extent, where there's this real pride about the music history, but also in some instances a bravado, and there's a brag we're the greatest music city in the world, all that kind of thing, which is fine, it's cool. But yeah, Sheffield is definitely not like that, and I think it's a noble trait, it's a noble characteristic. But the downside of that means that a lot of stuff doesn't get documented or celebrated in the way that it should. And so yeah, that was a big part of the motivation for doing this, because it's sort of like it needs, I suppose, I was going to say it needs a champion of sorts, but you've got to balance away. You can't come in and start going, F Manchester, we're the best, because that wouldn't be characteristic of the city and its sort of ethos. But yeah, it's a way of sort of just highlighting all the things that have taken place here and realizing that there's a lot to celebrate in a way that isn't sort of braggy and bravado. But yeah, it's like, that's been a massive thing. Like the ingrained humility of the city is a really significant part of the culture. Yeah.
And how easy was it to get people on board in terms of interviews? Obviously, quite connected, I imagine, as an established journalist. But
yeah, I mean, obviously I've been doing this for years, and so I have contacts with PR people and record labels and managers and stuff. So for the most part, well, the honest answer is it varies. I think the thing is, when I'm doing my day-to-day job as a music journalist, when I'm interviewing people, it's usually because they're in the press cycle. They've got something to promote, be it a book, a record, a tour or whatever. So they've got an allocated period of time where they know they're going to be doing interviews. And if I'm, bulk of my freelance work's for The Guardian. So generally speaking, if I get in touch and it's like, do you want to speak to The Guardian for an article? It's usually a pretty quick yes. It's quite easy to set up. With a book, you're much more reliant on people's goodwill because they don't really have anything to promote. They don't have anything to get out of it, especially the more established artists. So some of the bigger people, especially when you're dealing with management and PR, that can be difficult because it's sometimes you really get the feeling like, I don't think this message is being passed on to the artist at all, because the manager's seeing it and it's like, this isn't a priority right now. We're on tour. We've got this to do. So some interviews took a long, long time to get. And there's one or two that I would have liked to have got that I didn't. But the vast majority were okay. You know, I think generally speaking, I would say when you're dealing with artists directly, it's easy. When you're having to navigate through artists and PR people, it can be a little bit more stalled. So yeah.
What about people like Matt Helders? Was that easy to get hold of? Was he as easy, rather?
Well, no, because I mean the blanket response anytime you put in an interview request for the Arctic Monkeys is no. You know, that's what it is. I don't even think it gets put to them these days. It's just if you get in touch with Domino, their label, or management or whatever, it's just no. They don't do press, and you know they're not really in Arctic Monkeys mode at the moment. So yeah, no, it was a no. But then we've got friends of friends, and I ended up I had a conversation with the manager and sort of explained the book and stuff. And I think thankfully we've got friends of friends who'd kind of put in a good word and sort of explained that I was sound and coming at it and whatnot. So that one wasn't too bad, but I think if I didn't have that history and experience and I guess somewhat connection, it probably wouldn't have happened. Yeah, especially because the timeline of when I was doing the book just came after they'd finished all those huge shows and whatnot. So like the last thing they want to be doing is talking about what they were doing 20 years ago as a band when they're like, we need time apart from one another and are doing their thing. So yeah, that one was kind of okay, but it took a little bit of work. Yeah,
And then you got the likes of John McClaw, who's great value in terms of his insight.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, John. I mean, like I didn't know John super well before. Like we kind of operated in slightly different circles in Sheffield, but he was great. He was really encouraging, really welcoming. I went round to his house, made me a coffee, which, if memory serves, was like nuclear strength coffee. Just, I don't know how much that speaks to his character, but and I think he had like 3 in the time I had 1 or something. But yeah, we went round and no, he was great. I actually like a lot of those guys from the sort of North Sheffield contingency of the indie bands that I didn't know super well, but they were some of my favourite interviews actually because they're all really funny. They're self-deprecating, and I think there'd been enough time away from like all the huge like fanfare around the Monkeys and stuff that often ended up they got really fed up of. There's been enough distance from that now that I ended up having quite open and honest conversations with them about that and the way that they felt. And, you know, it's quite, you know, John was great. He was really refreshing, you know, speaking about, being honest about, you know, feeling jealous of Alex and all these kind of things and things that maybe I got a sense that comes from a place of peace now because they're sort of happy with where they are in their careers and they've established a firm sense of identity and all these things. So it was quite nice to speak to people like that at that period in their lives because I think it was, yeah, it felt like they were in a good place. But also John's just dead funny and he's got loads of good stories and, as I said, self-deprecating. Yeah, I really enjoyed chatting with John for this book, actually, yeah.
No, it's interesting that because I spoke to like Chris McClure and Andy Nicholson recently.
Yeah.
And I think that 20-year thing, like, yeah, even maybe people wouldn't suspect it, but even Chris had a hard time dealing with the album cover thing. He didn't want anything to do with it for a long time.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's like, I think it's like anything, isn't it? Like if you end up getting defined by something that you did, or even like tangentially did when you're really, really young, when you're in a period of your life where you're still figuring out who you are, what you want to do, what you're like, but other people have decided this is what you're defined by. That's a really tough thing to navigate, you know. And I think it was a tough thing to navigate for everyone, you know. Even be it the Monkeys, who had huge success, but still struggled to, you know, people wanted that debut album, you know, for a long period of time, and then, you know, all the other people around it as well. So yeah, I think anything where you become synonymous or associated with something at a young age, and then you fundamentally want to do different things, you know, it's once people have a defined image of who you are, it can be really difficult to navigate that. So yeah, it's interesting for sure.
Yeah, I think he said, like, you know, that when the Monkeys had fully taken off, he'd be out in Sheffield getting, you know, people coming up to him and he'd be like, wait a minute, they're loaded and I'm in my overdraft.
Yeah.
I'm still getting all this attention.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that was, yeah, I can understand that. And it's tricky because that's where, you know, it's like when you do a book of this size and when you speak to people who, you know, were in bands 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, like, people deal with these things in different ways. Some get bitter and resentful and like they can't get over it and it defines their life, or others thankfully manage to find their own path and do their own thing and get over it. But yeah, I mean, that must be, yeah, could imagine that requires a great deal of patience and perseverance to sort of have to tolerate that. And yeah, just that idea that other people have really firm ideas of like who you are or what you're supposed to represent, or maybe where you're at in life and stuff, when it's in conflict with actually where you are. Yeah, that's a tricky thing.
And like there's the whole New Yorkshire thing with NME and stuff, and that was interesting to read about. Like, and the idea that you'd have bands that were actually from Sheffield as opposed to based there or whatever. That there was a bit of a divide kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the main divide really was like the Sheffield versus Leeds thing. There was like, I think there was a bit of overlap there. So it's like, I think you could split all that stuff between the sort of more arty side of things and the more indie side of things. Sometimes there's an overlap there, but the sort of more like long blondes, pink grease, black wire side of things. I guess what you would call like proto hipster type stuff, really, and then the more sort of traditional indie bands, your Monkeys, your Milburn, I guess Leeds, Kaiser Chief, etc. like that. So yeah, there was definitely a cultural split at that point because it was tribal. It was sort of, I think like that was one of the reasons why I enjoyed interviewing a lot of the North Sheffield lads so much, because like I was with all the Poncy, RE, synthy lot back in the day, and so I wouldn't go as far to say we would have been enemies, but we were definitely, I was mincing around Sheffield with like makeup on and dyed black hair, looking like some bootleg version of the Horrors early on or something like that. And, and so they would have looked at me and thought, who the fuck, and so there would have been, we were operating in different worlds at that point. But I think that's okay. I think that period of time, it was okay to be defined as much by what you liked as much by what you didn't like, and so yeah, there was definitely a sort of synth versus guitars divide there, and a lot of that was geography as well. You had that North Sheffield contingent who were sort of quite close knit and a bit suspicious of outsiders, and then you had other people who maybe disliked that because they thought it was a bit too laddie or a bit too traditional rock, to whatever. So yeah, there was definitely a cultural split there, like culturally and geographically within Sheffield, but then also like some of the Sheffield lot wouldn't have attached themselves with the Leeds crew at all, because I think that's probably more like an ingrained like football history thing. I think like there is a bit of a Sheffield Leeds rivalry. It's not something I particularly get involved in because I don't have a football roots here, but yeah, there is like a bit of a hatred between some of them.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like the Milburn section was interesting as well because they were like, they didn't put any stocking into like the history of the Sheffield music, really. Like, it wasn't like they were influenced or inspired by anything that had come before, really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I remember chatting to Joe about that, and he was really open and honest and just sort of said, we weren't bothered about Jarvis, we weren't bothered about Long Pigs, we weren't bothered about, any of that stuff. I think in their words, they were angry young lads and, wanted to sort of start from scratch kind of thing, which, yeah, again, I think is good. It goes back to that tribal thing I was mentioning before. I think like, it's sort of, I think like a dislike of other bands and what they represent in some instances at a certain period of time can be quite good and can be quite healthy. But yeah, they seem to have very little acknowledgement for that stuff that had gone before, just disinterest, I think. But maybe also lack of knowledge as well, because I think when you're that young, like the idea of listening to something that is kind of like your parents' music, you always want to push back against the thing that's come before, right? Like in the same way that like Gen Z think millennials are lame now, and millennials thought Gen X are lame or whatever. I think Britpop was lame and all that kind of stuff. There's always like a pushback from the new generation against what the preceding one did, and yeah, I think they just didn't want to be attached with anything that had come before at that point.
And the stuff about them with NME is mad. Like, I think he says at one point his dad wanted to sue NME or something.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how literally he was in that, but yeah, that's certainly, he said that. Yeah, I mean, they got a very, very hard time. I mean, like, you go back and you read, well, not even just NME, like any coverage of those bands, and you won't find a review or an interview or anything without a mention of Arctic Monkeys or whatever. And, that and often in a derogatory sense, you know, that they were copycats or whatever, even though, you know, obviously the Monkees are on record as sort of saying Milburn were an inspiration on them and Milburn came first and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I think they had a very, very hard time with that. And, you know, when you go back and you read some of those reviews and they were brutal, you know, this was a time where the music press was crueler, for sure. And it's pretty vicious in points. You know, I mean, I didn't include it in the book because I couldn't find a source for it at the time, but there used to be a magazine in Sheffield at the time called Sandman. And in fact, it stretched to Hull at some point.
Yeah, there's one in Hull. Yeah,
So.
The Sheffield one actually gave a horrendous review of my band when we played the Grapes. Yeah, but yeah.
But I remember there was a Sheffield band, and I couldn't track it down to find out who it was. It might have been Milburn, it might have been one of the other lads, but they said we can't even fart anymore without someone saying it smells like the Arctic Monkeys, which I think that sort of captured the feeling amongst those lot after the whole sort of hysteria around the band and stuff. So yeah, I think they struggled with that, you know. And I don't think they were as strong a band, and you know there is some criticism that you can lay there, but I totally understand that that must have been massively frustrating to sort of be cited as an influence on the most successful band to come out of Sheffield and then labelled just like a derivative copycat. And I think, as Joe says in the book, and I think another element that I would add there as well, I think it's probably important to point out, is that things are a bit more open now, but this was still a time of a really London-centric media. And so it was almost like, you know, I think Joe said it was like they'd pick their one Sheffield band and no one else was allowed through kind of thing. And I think there's some validity in that, actually, you know, okay, we're surprised that these bunch of working class northerners are able to make this, but you know, that's an anomaly, that's a one-off, you know, all the rest of shit kind of thing or whatever. I think there is a little bit of truth in that. It was, there wasn't much space allowed for stuff beyond the headline acts kind of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, how much power Enemy had, especially the reviewers. Mentioned it a few times on here, but I think a band called 10,000 Things got a 1 out of 10 for their album, and it kind of killed them off.
Well, yeah, because that's Sam Riley's band, wasn't it?
Yeah. But how do you reconcile that as a reviewer? I mean, would you do that? I don't know. Not for that specific band, but I mean, would you give someone a 1 out of 10? I don't know.
I mean, I wouldn't now, but I mean, if I was writing for Enemy at that period of my life when I was younger, because I got into it, I wasn't really. It wasn't like I was a 19, 20-year-old writing for national titles. That took that was a few years later. So I don't know. I mean, maybe if I was that age, I mean, I think I did I did do one similar review for a publication that didn't have anywhere near as much weight as the Enemy. For that band, was it Brother/Viva Brother?
Right, someone mentioned them to me recently.
I did a similar thing for an online publication, but I think that, but generally no, I wouldn't. I don't know. I'd have to go back and listen to that record. It was garbage, but no. I mean, I think that is an example of wanting to sort of wield a level of power and be a little bit cocky and sort of be aware that you hold the future of a band in your, you know, palm kind of thing. But I mean, I'd have to go back and read it to remember. I do have vague memories actually of seeing that band at Fuzz Club in Sheffield, which was a sort of weekly indie night there. It was on Thursday. Tuesday night was the electronic night. Thursday was the indie one at the university. And I think they were playing, and I'm sure they had they'd had that review or the score or something printed on a t-shirt or something at the time. So they were kind of wearing it as a bit of a badge of honor at the time, but it did seem to kill it from what I recall. But I don't know, I mean, I don't know, you go back and you read Enemy from that period and there's some pretty bad writing in it, really. It's a lot of it does not hold up very well. So interesting time with that kind of, but I think everyone was just more bitchy. It was a bitchier time, you know, the bands were really bitchy about one another. The journos were bitchy, and I think it was a bit more, I think you look back on it now and it seems a bit spiky and it seems a bit harsh and unnecessary. But I do, good or bad, probably bad for the most part, did feel a part of the culture at the time, you know. I think either you were really good friends with bands or you were not necessarily enemies, but I do remember a lot of bitchiness between bands during that era. And yeah, I think that sort of permeated into the wider culture and the discourse, be it journalists, fellow musicians, and the way stuff was written about.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned like the Fuzz Club and that. Did you see a lot of early gigs from those bands, obviously in Sheffield?
Yes, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I mean, I saw loads of stuff there. I'd need to look back. I mean, I think all the ones that I list in the book, I was there for most of them. So yeah, I mean, basically anyone who was in Enemy 2005 to 2006 in any capacity would have come through there. I think, yeah, and I think I saw all the major Sheffield bands there. I don't think I saw Monkeys there. Saw Monkeys in some smaller places. Like there's another Sheffield venue called the Fez Club as well as the Fuzz Club. So the Fuzz Club was the weekly indie night. Fez Club was just this small little upstairs room. Saw the Monkeys there quite early on. But yeah, any band of Sheffield coming through around that period, I definitely would have seen at Fuzz. Yeah, and they had an annual festival called Fuzztival as well, which I then towards the end, like I'd started DJing and stuff, so I used to DJ that as well. But yeah, that was like a bit of a rite of passage, really. That was sort of it was one of those nights that I would go to and get a little bit stroppy because it's like the same shit would always get played, and like I'd just kind of sit moodily on the side. But then you kind of look back and yeah, it's kind of I got to see a lot of fun stuff there. Yeah, for sure.
And it sounds like you have like a bit of an eclectic music taste, but who were your preferred bands at that time in Sheffield in
So
the
like
2000s?
my big Sheffield band when I moved. So I moved to Sheffield 2004, which obviously if you look back, people will be synonymous with sort of Monkeys blowing up there. And I've warmed enormously to the Arctic Monkeys, but you know, I wasn't a fan initially at the time. It wasn't what I was looking for. I think having moved from a small town that was sort of like a bit boring and a bit violent and whatnot, and then to sort of come across a band who was singing about like small town northern life and violent, you know, all this. It felt like their world that they were depicting. I get was really powerful for a lot of people because like, hey, these lads look like us, these lads sound like us, they're writing about our lives. That was a really powerful thing for people. But for me at that point, I was like, I'm trying to escape this. I want my world to get bigger. So for me, my big Sheffield band around that time was Pink Grease, which were like, for people unfamiliar, they were Science and Mute Records, and they were like Sheffield's version of the New York Dolls. They were like glammy, trashy, sort of punky, sleazy rock kind of stuff. They were like a really good party band. They were camp. They were they made their own instruments. One guy called Nick sort of built his own synths from scratch that would take like years to make. He'd hand solder them all, like play the bits of it with a toothbrush and like proper crazy one-off inventions that sounded like nothing else. And they had a sax player and like Steve Santa Cruz, the guitarist, like had this sort of guitar that he'd picked up that was like a machine gun. It was like over the top camp fun, but it was big and it was colourful. And that was sort of, they were my band when I first moved to Sheffield. They were the first one that I connected with. It was like, I had a lot, when I moved to Sheffield from Driffield, a lot of my friends went to Leeds University instead. So I spent a lot of time in Leeds as well, along with Sheffield. So it was like, yeah, Blackwire and Pink Grease were my sort of two like indie bands of that era for sure.
Yeah, I remember me and my mate just like we was in Leeds for some reason and just walked into the Merrion Centre one
Mm.
lunchtime, and this band were playing and it was Pink Grease. We always kind of were fond of them after that, but yeah, that was funny.
I think I might vaguely remember that. Is that the one that was like the lead singer just sort of going all around the place or whatever or something?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite funny.
Yeah,
Quite
no,
enjoyed it.
I was really into them. And that was sort of, and there was sort of like a connected nightclub in Sheffield at the time, or club night, should I say, called Razor Stiletto, which was like, I guess, like the Sheffield's equivalent of Trash, like Errol Alkin's Night in London, which was like the mix of sort of sleazy, trashy, rock and roll type stuff with a bit more of electro type stuff and like 1970s New York stuff and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that was sort of my world around that time for sure.
And as a journalist writing for the Guardian, have you found it like it's been fine just staying in Sheffield, or have you had to move around or anything for more work?
I mean, no, I mean, I've always been in Sheffield, so it's one of those where I felt like it was a disadvantage for a long period of time, and then it became an advantage, and I noticed people were definitely coming to me with more like specifically because I was known as the guy being in Sheffield. And so it was like I'd made it work for myself through sort of stubbornness and perseverance, combined with, I think, editors realizing that they have to have a broader range of voices and not be so London centric. So for a while it felt like a benefit. And I guess it still kind of does. I mean, I've written a book about the city, so it's kind of works in that sense. But there was loads of people realised that they didn't need to be in London after COVID. So like loads of writers and journalists have all sort of moved up here now. So I think there was a period where I was like, I'm the only guy in Sheffield kind of doing this thing, but I'm far from that anymore. So I'm not sure if, I don't know. Yeah, it works. It works. But then again, it's like the flip side is, I don't know whether I'd have been able to crack out a living doing this if I'd have moved to London when I was younger. You know, I think like when I got into doing this, I was working minimum wage jobs in the NHS, just temp jobs, bouncing from temp jobs. And, you know, I was writing, getting up at 5, 6 in the morning, writing, going and doing these jobs, coming home and doing that. And like the income that I generated through doing that work wouldn't have sustained me in a bigger city. So I think on one hand, I owe Sheffield for being able to do what I've done, but there's definitely periods where it's been like, I know I've missed out on work because I'm not in London, or it's like, you know, because like a PR or a record label, it's like, why are they gonna pay for my travel to come down to London to do something and interview someone or whatever it is, when they can just get someone on the doorstep where they don't have to pay an extra 150 quid or whatever it is. So it's been mixed, but I think overall I've made it work. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And then obviously the book is it spans over a long period, not just the 2000s.
Yes.
From the 60s onwards. Like, was it obvious who you wanted to interview, or how did it pan out?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you write a book on the history of music in Sheffield, it's like there are certain artists and bands, whatever, that like they just have to be included, right? You know, your Monkeys, your Pulps, your Hawleys, Human League, Cabaret Voltaire, etc. You know, there are certain artists that are just sort of so centrally important that it's self-evident. And then beyond that, there wasn't a process. I mean, there wasn't a process like I had a big list and I just started ticking them off. It was finding ones that connected to the themes of the book, which is about this sort of unifying independent spirit. And I also wanted to write a book where it's not just bands, it's about DJs and nightlife as well. So it's sort of this, because the two are so intrinsically linked in Sheffield, you can't write about bands and leave out electronic music and vice versa. You know, they overlap so significantly. So some of it was just sort of laid out. But the thing is, when you write a book proposal for a non-fiction book, you do a chapter by chapter breakdown. So I kind of roughly plotted it out up front. And then obviously you do more and more research and some stories pop up. So it was a combination of picking out people that sort of fitted in with the themes. And then also, I just also wanted to cover people that didn't get covered that much generally as well, making sure it wasn't just all the big hitters. And there's lots of people that don't usually get covered in these kinds of stories and books. So sort of a mix of the headliners and the support acts, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, did you discover like music you hadn't heard before, like doing the book?
I mean, bits and bobs. I mean, I think the music discovery part of it was probably already over. Like I've spent years and years and years digging out Sheffield music and stuff. So I don't think there was like any bands that was like, oh God, I hadn't heard them. There was a few like little, there was more stories, I would say, rather than artists. I feel like the music I knew pretty firmly. But yeah, the stories and stuff it was always interesting to discover new bits. You know, like when I was doing the 1960s stuff, which covers, so like Peter Stringfellow was a club promoter in Sheffield in the 1960s and put on loads of stuff. And he had this rival club promoter called Terry Thornton who ran the Esquire. The Esquire subsequently turned into being the Lead Mill. And I was kind of digging into his story and whatnot, because when he got out of promoting, he ended up getting in the jewellery business. And then I'd later found out he got imprisoned because he hired a hitman to take out his ex-wife. And he delivered a nail bomb to her in Sheffield, which went off and blew her arm off. And like, this was a major thing. He went to prison for it. And like, you know, I really went down a rabbit hole with this, and like I managed to find like a prison newsletter from the time that he was incarcerated, where he was sort of proclaiming his innocence, that he'd been fitted up by Manchester gangsters who wanted to take over his jewellery business and all this kind of thing. And so I was like, oh, I need to know more about this. And I got in touch with someone who was involved in the campaign of kind of getting him out. because he did get released early, and I had a conversation with him, and then I got this very, very panicked message from him. It was like, the last time someone started poking around in this, and it wasn't that long ago, they had someone turn up on the front door with a shotgun. He's like, I strongly advise you to not go down this road. So, you know, it was more little bits like that, really, where you don't think when you're poking around in like club promoters in the 1960s that you're going to be like warned off, you know, because you might have gangsters turning up on your door with a shotgun or whatever. So, yeah, I think like most of the music was there because I've just done so much searching and whatnot. But it was more those little stories. They were the sort of, they were the little discoveries that kind of really made it more interesting, I suppose.
Yeah. Sounds like that could be like a whole separate book on that.
Yeah, or a podcast or something. Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, the guy's dead, so like he wouldn't be able to speak about it. But yeah, it was a mad little discovery that, and it's really not been like documented very much at all. So yeah, hopefully, because I did go ahead and write about it, so hopefully no one will turn up on my door with a shotgun. But we'll see.
And I suppose, which band or artist kind of resonates with you the most from Sheffield?
I mean, I think if there's one artist that like embodies Sheffield, I think it's probably Cabaret Voltaire because they were like the first, they were the earliest. You know, I mean, they started in 1973. You know, they predated punk, and they were just this sort of consistently experimental, pioneering group who, like, you know, they did post-punk, they did industrial, they did house, they did techno. They inspired, like, you know, an entire generation of people within the city. They inspired people to move to the city. And this was at a time where there was so little going on in Sheffield. They opened their own studio called Western Works, an old cutlery factory in a former Young Socialist headquarters. And they turned it into this place that they opened 24/7, that they would make their own stuff there, but they were also really avuncular and generous, and they would invite people there. A lot of Sheffield bands. And so, you know, for example, like New Order, you know, when after Ian Curtis had died, the very first ever recordings that were made after Ian had died as New Order were in Sheffield at Western Works. You know, they'd come to sort of work with these people who were kind of being deemed pioneers of electronic music, which of course New Order would go on to be. But, you know, the genesis, the first ever recordings of New Order actually took place in Sheffield because they went to go work with the Cabs. And yeah, so I just think they embody this sort of, like, we spoke earlier about like the humble attitude of the city, this idea of just getting your head down and doing the work. The pride is in the work rather than the talking about the work. But yeah, they were just sort of endlessly, ceaselessly experimental, innovative, influential, and they did it for a long period of time. And yeah, so I think if there's one band that sort of embodied the city for me, it's the Cabs. And also as well, you know, they came back last year, and I got to see them in Forge in Sheffield, which was, you know, it could have been a disaster. You know, it's two guys in their 70s, and, you know, but it just wasn't. It was incredible. It was in this, you know, old Forge steelworks, and it sounded like properly blew your head off. So yeah, I think the Cabs are the group that, yeah, embody Sheffield for me.
And that's where the title of the book came from, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the title of their 1990 album that they did, partly in Chicago with Marshall Jefferson, who's a house producer, then partly in Sheffield with the Fon Force crew, who were Mark Bryden and Rob Gordon, who were producers who worked at Fon Studios, which kind of Fon was like the genesis for Warp in many ways. That was kind of where it started in some respects. So yeah, they very kindly let me nick that title. Yeah.
Yes. And like, yeah, the venue's obviously a big part of the book, like the different venues in Sheffield.
Yeah.
Like obviously some iconic venues. Like, well, how is it looking these days? Obviously, there's a lot about the Leadmill recently and stuff like that. Like, how do you see it in terms of independent venues?
I mean, it's great. I mean, I think particularly on the smaller end of things where it's like DIY venues, like really small places, that seems really healthy at the moment. You've got a really good network of venues that are all doing very specific individual things. Like, you know, Delicious Clam are doing more like, I guess, kind of punky, noisy, alt-rock kind of stuff. Gut Level's like well, not necessarily a queer club, but, you know, queer-friendly, more dance stuff. Hatch doing experimental stuff. Lugol is like punk and metal. All these little micro venues that have got really distinct personalities, but all sort of connected. And then, like, you know, like Sydney and Matilda's, I think, has sort of stepped up and been really important recently. So it's like at the smaller end of things, it's really good. Sheffield has always missed out on like mid-sized venues. You know, like everyone in Sheffield always like everyone wants the Brood and L kind of thing. You know, that's like the dream venue for Sheffield because it's just that sort of like 500 cap venue. But then again, the Crook Social Club, where I don't know when this is going out, but I'm doing my book launch there on May 7th, the day it comes out. You know, that there's independent promoters starting to do stuff in there more and more now, which is great because that is a proper old school working men's club with a huge 500 cap room. Yeah, so it feels good, and there's new stuff, there's new venues forthcoming. You know, it's still like if we compare ourselves to Manchester, for example, it's like it's lacking compared to a city like that, but there's a lot of really good people doing good work. And yeah, the Lead Mill thing is, I've not been to the new one yet. It's only been open a month or so, Electric Studios, which has sort of taken over there, which at the moment looks like it's gearing up more to be a club than a gig venue. There's more DJ listings than there are bands, but whether that's just a temporary thing, I don't know. And the Lead Mill they currently have a relocation fund campaign going. So they're talking about opening again in the city, whether that'll happen or not. So it's it feels like it's in a transitional period. It's like it's at the grassroots level, it feels healthy. But it feels like there's also sort of more on the way. So we'll see. Yeah, but I'm feeling pretty good about it at the moment.
And what about as someone that's reviewing music and kind of being involved with it for a living? How do you see the landscape of music now compared to previous eras? Do you think it's as healthy as it ever was? Or
I mean, I think that from a creativity point of view, yeah, always. I mean, I think like the industry side of things is kind of fucked in some ways. You know, I think a lot of artists are struggling more than ever. Obviously, there's been a huge focus, like via the MVT, on the impact on grassroots venues and stuff. And I did a really big investigative piece for the Guardian. I can't remember if it was last year, or the year before, on the realities of touring for artists now, where I spoke with a lot of people, and we kind of had a really open and frank conversation. They gave me their touring budgets and all this kind of thing, and kind of showed a lot of people operating at a loss now, and all the implications that has on class and who gets to do this. You know, that if you want to be a young person starting a band now, the means required to do it means that you maybe have to come from a position of means and privilege and all this kind of thing. So it's definitely like the obstacles there are challenging for sure. But I think the motivation and the creativity and the innovation and stuff, I don't think that ever changes. I think all the stuff around it does, and you just have to find a way to navigate through it. But that said, there's so much stuff out there now. I think cutting through the noise is difficult. I get sent so much stuff in my inbox, as does all journalists, and there's more and more music out there, and there are fewer and fewer places to get it covered. Right? It's at least from a journalistic point of view. Also, that's you see more of a shift towards playlist stuff or increasingly influencers and whatnot. So it's kind of changing, but yeah, I mean, I've always got hope in terms of the creativity of people, but it feels like a slightly precarious time for the industry from a journalistic point of view. There's a lot of, there's more places closing than they're opening. In terms of publications, there's no real way around that. So it can sometimes feel like it's contracting, but yeah, I'm always hopeful that there's good things around the corner.
yeah. How do you discover new music out of interest?
I mean, it's a mix of things.
It sense it by the sounds of it, but
yeah, I mean, so I mean, I've been doing this for so long. I'm on the mailing list of like hundreds of PR people, so that I get every time a new song gets announced from an artist, I get an email about it. I get sent out the albums months in advance. But on top of that, I listen to quite a lot of radio. Really, I do like digging around in shows in places like NTS and Worldwide and things like that. I follow individuals on, Insta and whatnot that I like their taste. I follow specific journalists. I have WhatsApp groups with friends where, like, on the first of every month, everyone shares their recommendations of things they've been digging and things like that. So it's a real combination of things, obviously on top of music journalism as well. So I try and keep it as sort of broad and open as possible, really. But yeah, I'm lucky that I get. Because the thing is, as lucky as I am that I get sent all that music, most of that music comes from people who are already in a position where they can afford a PR person. And so I think as a journalist, it's really your responsibility to make sure that you're not just getting involved at that point, and that you want to, you know, get under the surface a little bit and make sure you're finding stuff from people who maybe, you know, aren't in a position to hire a PR person.
Yeah, it does feel like that, doesn't it? Like, I don't know, I'm not massively involved with new music or anything, but it does feel like new bands without the money would struggle more these
Yeah, I
days. I
mean,
don't know.
I think the whole Cruise Beckham thing's been really fascinating because
Yeah, it's mental. Yeah.
it's just like it's been the most blatant example of someone just buying their way into the music industry. You know, like the guy's got the same PR person. I think, don't quote me on it because I need to remember off the top of my head. But there's like Oasis and people like that, right? I'm pretty sure he's with Doorbell, who do like massive PR company. And it's like, you know, and he's getting review like, and the shows are getting reviewed in like loads of major publications, including The Guardian. And it's like most bands of that size, like that's years and years and years of work, right? That's, you know, and it's real, and it just seems to be like accepted like with a bit of a shrug. And I know it's like an extreme example. Not everyone is David Beckham's son, and so there's going to be a novelty or a curiosity attached to it. But I wish there was a bit more pushback on stuff like that, because it's just like we're just allowing people to buy their way into this kind of stuff, and it's shit. So yeah, stuff like that really winds me up, and it's infuriating because it's like, rather than just why publish a review of someone who's going to get loads of press anyway because they've just bought it, and they're literally the only reason why they're getting this coverage is because of who their dad is. Like, just take a punt on someone else who hasn't got any of the means to do that, and like give them some coverage or whatever. You know, I'd like to see a little bit more. I think a lot of established publications tend to hedge their bets a little bit, and they wait for younger groups to break through and see if they've had some success and then sort of cover. I wish they would I wish they wouldn't do that as much and get in at ground level a little bit more. Like, you know, it's fine if you recommend a band and they turn out to be shit. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, you know, I'm always a little bit anti like nostalgia of like Enemy of the 70s and 80s and stuff, because you go back and you read that, and there's loads of sexism and racism and homophobia and all this kind of stuff, and it's not all like golden period. But one thing that I would say that it's good for, given it was a weekly publication, go back and look through the covers, and there'll be artists where it's like, who the hell is that? You know, but it's like editors felt passionately enough about this new group that's like, no, we're gonna put them on the cover, we love them, kind of thing, and they turn out to be nothing, and that's fine. I don't feel like I see enough of that taking place at the moment. And I'd like that. So yeah, that side of things infuriates me, I have to say.
Yeah, and like the festival slots that Cruise Beckham's getting just seems bizarre as well.
Well,
But
yeah, because he can afford a shit hot booking agent in the same way he
yeah,
can
yeah.
afford a shit hot PR person and manager and all these things. You know, it's like it's literally just buying your way in, and it's like, and I'm only really highlighting him because he's a most public example of that. But that's taking place on more micro levels, like all the time. You know, I won't name the band, but I was chatting with a friend of mine the other day who's like a really experienced tour manager, and he was talking about this band who they're just doing it all on like their parents' time, and they're like, he was talking like the money they're losing on these tours is like substantial because they're like hiring drivers to get to the venue. So they're basically like playing at rock stars, right? And so they were hiring dancers and trying to bring in pyrotechnics for small venues and all this stuff, and like just operating at like an absolutely gargantuan loss, just because it was just a status thing. It was a little plaything that they could do because it was all being funded. And yeah, it's, you know, all that stuff drives me nuts, and I'd like to see more pushback against it. I'd like to see more transparency on it. Whether that changes anything, I don't know. But yeah, it's a problem. It's a massive problem, and I don't see how it's going to get better at the moment.
What do you make of the whole geese thing? Obviously, that's been a bit of a big thing recently.
I haven't actually read that PsyOps article in Wired because I went to read it the other day and I'd hit my free articles for the month limit, so I have to wait until the end. So I haven't read that particular article, so I can't speak to it specifically. But they've hired some big firm to generate buzz and fans for them and stuff, right?
Yeah, it's like using like different AI techniques to like, or you know, get themselves in the algorithm or something. But
Yeah, I mean, I'd need to have read the article in detail to comment on it properly, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Although again, I mean, it's sort of it is interesting stuff like that. I think it's probably more common than people maybe
hmm.
realize. But then again, it's a weird one with geese because similar accusations were put at the Monkeys, right, which I kind of touch at in the book, right? Like obviously the technology's changed and the culture's changed, but they were accused of, before the term was a thing, of being an industry plant to some degree, right? Of being this sort of generated by false buzz and people being hired to go out and speak about, promote them on the streets, on forums, and all this kind of thing. And it's like I think those tactics can go on and take place, but at the end of it, there still has to. I don't think Geese have just become successful because of those things. I don't think. I think enough people have genuinely, sincerely loved that record. People are quite evangelical about him, and I don't think it's just because they've been that heavily manipulated by social media, but I don't know. I probably ought to not comment on this too much, really, because I haven't read that article, so I'm still waiting to dig into that a little bit more, but it's certainly curious of where we're at culturally, yeah.
Yeah, it's like you say with like the cutting through thing as well, like cutting through the noise. Like even good bands are gonna have to find a way to do that if you've not got like the taste makers, as they say, in place like they used to be.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, also as well, it's like it is a tricky time for stuff like that because even all these, I don't even know if you'd call them influencers really. And again, I'm not going to name names, but a lot of people who have sort of popped up now who just film themselves on Insta and hey, I love this record and stuff. A lot of them are under payola from record labels, and there's no, they're being paid to tell you that they like this record, which whether you have a problem with it or not is irrelevant really, but I think there should be some transparency there in the same way that we've put in place, like if it's a paid partnership or it's an ad on your post, you have to put that right. But they haven't seemed to have navigated this new world where people are sort of recommending things based on taste. So, some of those people that you're following that you're thinking that you've built up this rapport with and relationship with and sort of trusting their taste, some of which it's just, they're just being paid to sort of tell you that. So I think, yeah, I'd really like to see greater transparency with this kind of stuff because it's all well and good sort of saying that, me sort of saying, people like Geese because it's still good music. But I don't know, if you've managed to infiltrate mass audiences to get it on their radar in the first place, then, you're already at a massive advantage, aren't you? So, I think there's some sort of broken elements to the system at the moment. I'm not necessarily broken, but a bit shady and a bit secretive, and yeah, it's an interesting time.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting with people. I'm not saying he's guilty of that, but people like Anthony Fantana, like the following he has is mad. He's like millions of subscribers, and he's just like sits in front of a camera and says what he thinks about an album. It's like I suppose they're the tastemakers these days. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, that's. I mean, I guess he was kind of ahead of the pack a little bit on that front, right?
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's people are consuming short form video content now, and it's sort of. I think for me, I don't know. He's an interesting one because I guess he has kind of. I guess he's always had he's always been a critic to some degree, really. I think it's more the evolution of the more recent people, again without naming names, who have sort of they've never really claimed to be critics or journalists, so that they're investigating work critically in any capacity. They've always just framed it as, hey, this is me, you're following me because you like my personality, this is my music taste, here's photos and videos of me, and links to Spotify, things that I like. I think, the fact that they're sort of being, paid is kind of interesting terrain. But yeah, no, I think but I think there's a place for all of it, I think, in a way, I think it makes a case that sort of criticism and journalism is sort of maybe arguably more important than ever if you can sort of genuinely lay claim to being, not on the payola of record labels and not, there's a lot of PR masquerading as journalism at the moment, and I think greater transparency and distinction needs to be made between there. And so I think you could argue really that there's a greater need for stuff that is not on the take more than ever.
No, yes, it is interesting. Like speaking to like Hardfi and Preston from the Ordinary Boys recently, like they both said, you could probably do with someone like Enemy in its old form these days.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there is. I think certain people who grew up in times of a certain way that media worked are missing having like a one-stop shop for like because it's confusing. It's like it's disparate. There's so much going on. I think people struggle to find stuff a little bit. So yeah, I'm sure there are definitely people that would crave returning to that format. And it certainly seems culturally that there's a lot more noise being made about people wanting to switch off a little bit more and, you know, go back to means of consumption that are less hooked up to streaming and all this kind of thing. So yeah, who knows? Maybe there could be an appetite for that. But the problem is that it's whether people would pay for it. And the reality is historically, you know, if people were still paying for that kind of thing, it would still exist and it'd still be in circulation. So I think you've got a balance between sort of pining for something when it was simpler times and the realities of whether people would actually engage with that and buy it. But you know, I'd welcome someone to have a punt and see how it panned out. But I don't know. I know enough people that work at publications and how challenging it is. I'm not sure a weekly music publication could thrive and survive in the current climate. I don't know. Even though, ironically, I do think there'd be an appetite for it. But it's just, you know, I think people wanting things and people paying for things are two very different things.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's, you know, and that's another difficult thing, right? Because like you can subscribe to so much now. You know, it's not only various music publications and whatnot, but individual writers have Substacks and stuff for the same amount that you might have once paid for a monthly subscription to a print publication that contained tens of writers and whatnot. So like, you know, there's only so much money that people have got to spend on these kind of things. So yeah, I don't know whether, I think I definitely get the sense there's an appetite for stripping things back and being simple and stuff, but people got to cough up and pay for it as well. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's where we're at, especially if you can just watch a video for free, right? That's, you know, that seems to be where we're at the moment.
Yeah, yeah. All right, mate. Well, going back to the book then. Obviously, you mentioned it's out next month, and that
Yeah.
you're doing some live events around it then.
Yeah, so doing a launch in Sheffield on the day that it's out on May 7th at Crook Social Club. I'll be in conversation with Elizabeth Alker from BBC there. And we've got a bunch of guest DJs there. Warp Records are going to play. There's a local label called Memory Dance and Do It the Sen that are going to DJ. And Gut Level, who I mentioned before, who run the venue. And Adrian Flanagan, who is behind Moon Landings and Eccentronic Research Council and whatnot. I've asked him to host bingo because we're holding it in a working men's club. But he's going to bring his synths and do like psychedelic bingo or something like that. And then I'm in London on the 11th of May in conversation with Ben Beaumont Thomas, who's the music editor of The Guardian. And then I'm in Brighton on the 22nd with Stephen Malander from Cabaret Voltaire. And then I'll be doing a few festivals and stuff throughout the year, but I won't just list all those dates. Yeah, they're the initial ones that we're doing around the publication of the book, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, the moon landings are race, aren't they?
They're great, yeah, I love them. I think so the launch is on the 7th, and then I think they're playing in Leeds the night after on the 8th, actually, so I might pop over and see them, yeah. Yeah, good bit of chaotic fun. Kind of, the moon landings kind of remind me of like why when I came to Sheffield and I fell in love with Pink Grease, that same kind of vibe, really, just like bit manic, bit chaotic, fun, trashy, bit sleazy, bit wrong, but in a good way.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, mate. Well, is there any advice you'd give to someone trying to write a book? Like, how hard has it been?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's definitely hard. What advice would I give to someone writing a book? I mean, know what you're doing and plan it as much as you can. God, I don't know. I haven't been asked this question yet. What advice would I give to someone writing a book? Get all your interview requests out up front. That would be my biggest bit of advice because I didn't do that, and then it took so long to land some. Because I started writing my book in sections. I was like, right, I'll do all my interviews and research for the 1960s. I'll write that bit. Same for the 70s and stuff. And then as I got along, I realized if I carry on doing this, I'm just going to have this huge backlog of interviews that I haven't been able to secure in time. So I think planning and strategy, but more than anything, I don't know, if you've got the desire to write a book, even if you've not got a deal and whatnot, I don't know, just do it. Just put pen to paper and see how it goes and write a proposal and send it round. I think, you know, it's, yeah, I think just get into it, just write the thing. And then, I mean, what I've given is just absolutely terrible advice. If anyone is watching this or listening to this does want to write it, by all means email me and I'll think about that more thoroughly and give you some coherent advice, because I've just given you the most general useless waffle there. But I haven't been asked that question yet, so I'll think on it a little more. And in all sincerity, if anyone does want to get in touch, I'd be happy to discuss that a little bit more. But yeah, that's all I can think of at the moment.
And then one to finish on, if you had to pick an artist or a band from Sheffield, who would you watch and in what venue?
From any time period? Or
Yeah, anytime, yeah. Could have briefed you on that, to be fair.
No, that's all right. That's all right. It's good to get the old one thrown at me. I think maybe maybe early period Human League. I think would be in like. In fact, do you know what? Do you know what I'm going to pick? Because this is quite a Sheffield lineup, and it's quite funny. So there's one night at the Limit nightclub in 1978, which was this club that was on West Street in town. It was like Monday night. I think entrance was 50p, and it was like all up and coming bands. And on the bill, you had the Human League and Def Leppard on one bill. I'm not a huge like metal guy really, but I think just for the sake of seeing two bands who've come to define Sheffield in many ways, but are complete polar opposites, pulled in completely contrasting crowds who frankly didn't get on that well. I think I would have quite liked to have been in that room that night. That would have been quite funny to have this like dead futuristic, like synth pop, like we hate guitars, this is the future, and like real back to basics, like riff heavy stuff. That would have been a weird vibe, and I think I'd have been quite up for like experiencing that.